Today we are interviewing Kamla Hedges, who prior to her retirement in 2011 held the position of Director of Library Relations for the legal publishing company, the Bureau of National Affairs. Prior to her promotion to this position, Cami, as she prefers to be called, was Director of BNA's Corporate Library. She had started working at BNA in 1983 as a reference librarian. Cami, let's begin with a little of your personal history. Could you tell us a little bit about what life was like when you were young and perhaps today?
Well, Pat, I was born and grew up in Covington, Virginia, a very small town in the western part of the state, a paper mill town, and that's why we were there. My father was a chemist at the paper company, and it was like all small town, good living times. I graduated from high school and went to the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and then to George Peabody College at Vanderbilt University for my library degree.
Mm-hmm. So you became a credentialed librarian, but not necessarily a law librarian. How was it that you sort of were attracted into our branch of the library profession, law librarianship? Did someone play a role in that process, or did you come to it through perhaps some other means?
Well, I came through other means. I had people pointing me in the right direction from an early time, from the librarian at the Covington Library where I worked in the summer, who took an interest in me and talked about library education and talked about all the different roles in the library and made the job interesting for me as a summer job. And the superintendent of schools in Covington, when I graduated, at a reception, asked me about my career and suggested that I should consider going into the library field. He was aware of how many schools were hiring librarians at that point and saw it as a growing profession. And in library school, a professor urged us to apply to large libraries for our first job. So that summer that I was graduating, New York Times carried an ad for 4 jobs, beginning jobs at the Connecticut State Library, that matched my interest in a large law library and my desire to live in New England. So I interviewed, and then I moved to Hartford for the job in the history and genealogy division. But within the year, the library established a new position to serve the state legislature. And I applied for it and moved into the law and legislative reference branch at that time. And the state library had a very large law collection, very historic law collection. And Howard Walker, the law librarian, had a good understanding of legal bibliography, and he was a good teacher. So for several years I had a private tutor working with me as I answered reference questions from the clerks in the Connecticut Supreme Court, from staff with the legislature, and from the practicing attorneys who often used the library in Hartford. It was a wonderful way to start, and to really seal the deal as a law librarian, as I sat in this beautiful reference room in the state library, and my desk was in the center. I faced the picture of George Goddard. George Goddard had been one of the long-serving librarians for the state of Connecticut, the state library, and he was the 3rd president of AALL. He was elected about 1910, I believe. And that's how I got here. Yes.
Yeah. Well, you and I, of course, go back to both of our days in Connecticut. I was working in the state at the time, and you were working at the state library, doing legislative stuff. And so I remember your boss, Howard, coming to various meetings and seeing you at the New England chapter and also at the National Association. And then we both ended up migrating down to, of all places, Washington, D.C.,
Exactly.
where we are today, in fact, here at American University doing this interview. And you went initially into the law firm world, the real world, as I'm sure some people call it, before you joined B&A. Could you talk a little bit about that era in your life?
I could. I could also talk a little bit about the state library, because as a large library, it did open a lot of opportunities for me.
Mhm.
At that time, there was a focus on getting information, legal information, making it more available to the general public. And there was a division within the state library that served state institutions and public libraries.
Mhm.
The state was sending all of its legal materials out to the public libraries, and so I went out with a group to train librarians in the public libraries on how to make their information more accessible to the public and serve the public.
Mhm.
We also did that for prison libraries. And it was just a good time to a good experience with reference work and teaching and training and using a lot of different materials. At this time I became involved, during these years, I became involved with AALL.
Mhm.
And with Law Librarians of New England, with the local chapter. And through AALL, I met other state law librarians,
Mhm.
and we produced a publication that AALL distributed. It was mimeographed. Now that sounds like prehistoric times, doesn't it?
That was old technology by today's standards.
Indeed.
Yes.
But we listed all of the current, it was published several times a year, and we listed all the current material that was being published in the States, and it
Mhm.
gave libraries all over the country a chance to stay current with materials.
That must have been interesting work, and networking with your counterparts in other places must have been its own good experience.
It
as well.
was, and AALL facilitated that.
Mhm.
As I went to meetings and we met in groups, and state folks got together, and we exchanged a lot of ideas.
I think those were the days before AALL had devised the special interest section grouping, where people of like inclinations, including the state and local court librarians, sort of became an SIS, and you could network that way as well. So you really were doing it before that era.
We were,
Yeah.
informally,
Uh-huh.
but it was working. And I think there were also committees then at the time which let us mix with people who were doing other various jobs in
Mhm.
libraries. But that was before SISs came along.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And then you worked in the state, at the state library, doing legislative stuff, helping prisoners. You probably had a number of special clients from the prison world who would come back and make the word get around that you were the place to go to ask things. You probably had plenty of
Letters,
clients.
we did indeed.
I remember in my days, before I was in Connecticut, I was in Texas. And at the time, Texas Supreme Court had a series of docket numbers that started with the letters OC and then a number. And most of their cases had docket numbers that were just a simple set of numbers to keep track of their cases. And one time, my boss, Al Coco, and I were up in Austin for some reason, and we had occasion to talk to a justice on the court, and we casually asked what the OC meant and some of your docket numbers. And he said, well, those are our clients, as we call them, because they're the pro ses from prisons trying to, prosecute their appeals. And so we have to help them out so much with their research. So it sounds like what you were doing was much the same kind of thing at the library end.
Connecticut was a small state, and they were attentive to the different areas that that needed information and getting the information out to them. We had a Governor's State Information Bureau, that I staffed once a week with other state employees, and people could call in and ask questions during while the legislature was in session. So it was a good beginning, very good
I
beginning.
imagine you had to be on your toes the whole time, especially when those questions would be coming in.
Well, if you're a reference librarian, you stay on your toes
Yeah.
so much of the time because they're often on-demand questions.
Well, that's true, and the people who come to you are stumped, so it's not the easiest stuff usually they're dealing with anyhow.
Another project in Connecticut was I did the initial work of visiting the local libraries, law libraries. Some of them were in courts, some of them were in tiny little cottages, and I had to track down the key to get in. But that was the beginning of the steps that led to the judicial branch libraries around the state that are now staffed by librarians.
Mm. That's interesting to watch that all develop and have been part of it at the inception. Must be somewhat exciting in its own right.
It is.
Mm-hmm. Well, you eventually, as I already mentioned, moved down a bit south of Connecticut to a place called Washington, D.C., and you started there with law firms, and then eventually, of course, went with BNA. You want to talk a little bit about that era in your life and that transition?
Well, by the mid-'70s, there was a growth spurt in law firm libraries. Law firms were getting larger, they were hiring more associates, and they were getting a lot more law books. They realized the need to have libraries, and so there were a number of jobs that came open, and they were seeking professional librarians. And Peyton Neal, who had helped Steptoe and Johnson hire Steve Marginton to start their library, when he learned that they were looking for an assistant and a second professional on the staff, called me and introduced me to Steve, and pretty soon I was moving to Washington to Steptoe. That was a very busy era when we were doing so much reference work. We were doing interlibrary loan non-stop every day. We were compiling legislative histories, which was quite an art form for law firm libraries at the time. Multi-volume works, pulling together all of the materials that went into making the law. And so we did a lot of work with Union List and a lot of collaborative work with other firms to establish a list of what we had so that it made loaning and borrowing easier during that time. And during that time, we got our first Lexus terminal, that big red box with the printer.
Oh, that was old technology. Today's viewers don't have any inkling of what life was like then. And because of the capacity of the computers, in order to access the information on it, if you didn't know exactly what you wanted, you had to be very careful. I remember the old standing joke was, if you used phrasing and wanted to have the computer find it, you had to misspell it, just like the people who typed in the stuff did when the companies wanted the law students to use their databases and essentially become quite dependent on them and quite enamored with them, so that when they went out into the real world and became normal paying customers, they would be good customers.
Yes.
In the long term. I suspect it's still the same way with today's law students coming up through the system and the database companies. So you were with Steptoe, and then later you went to Wilkinson, Cragen, and Barker.
And that was quite a different experience too.
Now you were head librarian there.
I was.
Yes.
Steptoe was a large law firm library operation and a sort of a separate entity in the law firm structure. Wilkinson was a small boutique firm, and when I went there, I really joined the legal team, and I attended their group meetings and monitored all of their interest. And each day, after the Congressional Record and Federal Register arrived, I would scan those, a quick read, and then dictate an index to all of the topics in the two publications. that our attorneys were interested in. Another pre-computer era.
And a lot of things we did in the
assignment.
pre-computer era that we still do some of the same things, but probably much more efficiently today.
Much more efficiently and much more thoroughly. I couldn't read every word of that. But it was at this time that I served on the board of LLSDC, the Law Librarian Society of DC, which was very active and very growing at the time.
Yeah, that was a wonderful organization. I enjoyed being a member for the entire time I was here in DC. Actually, I'm still a life member. They have accorded me that. I mean, I can keep my membership without having to pay dues.
That's very good, isn't it?
Yeah, I like that price. Unfortunately, ALL had to abandon that system some years ago for very good reasons. So the dues we pay there are fairly modest as retirees, though. So yeah. That's good in its own right, but it's nice to keep informed on what's going on and see the literature that comes out, and the Law Librarian Society, their newsletter, Law Library Lights, I enjoy reading. It's all online now, and that's a lot of fun. Yeah.
Well, since we talked about the red box, the Lexus red box at Steptoe, at Wilkinson we got a much smaller terminal, but it was operated with a telephone. So we would put the receiver on the phone.
The old acoustic connection technology,
Yes,
where
we
you had to dial the phone, listen for the computer on the other end to answer, and then plug the headset into a cradle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what we did, and we accessed Dialogue and Westlaw on that for a time.
Well, that was a different era. I mean, the technology.
Well, it was a start. It was
Yeah.
the beginning of what has very quickly become a much more technological approach to librarianship.
And I remember in those days the speed of the connection was so much slower than it is today. You would actually have to sit there and watch a page load. It would go from the top of the screen to the
That's
bottom,
right.
and there it would be. But it would take a few seconds to do this, the display. Now I think it just flashes right on.
Immediately, exactly.
Yeah. But it was a lot of fun. So you were with the firms for a few years, and then you went to the publisher, B&A, but not as, a salesperson or somebody like that. You were the librarian.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I had worked for the state government, and I had worked in 2 law firms in Washington, and picked up a lot of reference skills working with government documents and just government information. And I was interested in working in a corporation, and DC is a government town, not a corporate town, and one of the largest corporate libraries and one of the only corporate libraries in the city was at the publisher B&A. And a job opened when it was time for me to move. So I went to the library. And as you just mentioned, when I told people I was going to B&A, they asked if I were traveling a lot, because most of my colleagues knew B&A just through their sales representative.
Well, of course. That's who would come by and say hello to us.
But B&A had a very large library and quite a good-sized, strong professional staff to serve many different needs within the corporation. And so I moved into another world of law librarianship. I was the law librarian for a time, and then moved into the director's position. And during that time, we published our own book from the library staff called B&A's Directory of State Courts, Judges and Clerks. I was the first editor of that, and it's still being published.
I've noticed it's still
one of the most
cited.
popular book titles
Yeah.
that B&A has. That was a nice accomplishment, to be working with other people who were publishing, and the library staff got to publish as well.
Well, you sort of built on that then, and then when you became director of library relations, then you stepped out of the library as such, I believe, and into, I suppose, the realm of corporate governance or whatever.
Close to that.
Could we talk a little bit about that era? Because that's fascinating too, because I don't believe anybody else in the publishing world had anybody quite like that.
I think that's right. B&A had someone who, one of the assistants to the president, who would handle library matters when they came up. If ALL asked for something or SLA needed a contribution, Emily took care of it, and she was leaving the company for another job. And the president then was Bill Belts.
Mhm.
And he realized that this had turned into quite a sizable responsibility.
Mhm.
So he asked if I would be interested in being a library relations doing library relations for B&A, and I took the job, and with the responsibilities of managing the budget, of being the liaison to AALL and Special Libraries Association and the regions, of determining how the company would make contributions, how much the contributions, what we would support, and arranging special events, and then sometimes I acted as ombudsman when matters dictated that a customer needed someone to step in, and who understood library matters and work out a problem they had with the company. Those were rare, but it was a role I played as well.
But you're right, you would have the perspective of both sides to bring to the table. You'd understand the library and what the librarian might be thinking or wanting, and yet you had a sense of what the company had to have in the game too.
Exactly. I call this a two-hat job.
Exactly.
And inside B&A, I would put on my librarian's hat and say, oh, I'm not sure that new policy is going to go over well. Maybe we should consider something else. And when I was working with the associations, with CRIV, and working with Kay on the first edition of the Fair Business Practices Guide, I would put on my publisher's hat and talk about standards that might not work because of other things going on in the company. But I think that B&A was the first to establish this position outside of sales or training, but to make it part of corporate relations, reporting to the president. It was a good spot to be in to accomplish what needed to be done.
Well, it was a good company too. I mean, B&A had such an excellent reputation. I mean, we have over the years had an occasional, should we say, misunderstanding between customers and companies, and sometimes companies may have pushed their end a little more vigorously than some of us thought were appropriate. But B&A was always a fair player. I mean, they were a good solid reputation from the get-go. And with you in that role, it was just smooth as silk in many ways.
Well, because I had experience in the field, in various libraries and at B&A, so that I knew the library field and I knew B&A's corporate culture, and that corporate culture really determined how we moved forward. B&A's policy or B&A's thinking was that librarians and library associations were the ones who were the best judge of the programs and the training that needed to take place, and so our approach was to provide to enable the associations to provide this, and not to recreate the wheel on our own.
Now, I remember the year I was president of AALL, the association went through one of its periodic problems with cash flow and paying bills, and we were looking to reduce the number of issues that year of the Law Library Journal from its customary 4 to two to basically save money. And the company came to our rescue. In translation, I'm sure you in that role had a great deal to do with, I guess Bill was president still, and we got a corporate grant to basically enable us to keep publication at the traditional 4 issues. And then the following year, we had gotten ourselves back on an even keel financially, so it could be sustained. But that was
Well,
a tremendously important to many librarians. Certainly to me as president, I didn't particularly relish being the president that had to go to the membership and said, "Okay, we're cutting out half of this thing that so many of you rely on."
But that contribution met our standards for our goals for helping through library relations, helping the associations, and we also stepped in and helped underwrite the education summit when AALL had determined that it was time to rethink the approach to education programs.
I mean, they're doing so many new and wonderful things now, and it had to start someplace.
Well,
And
it
someone
did,
had to
and-
brainstorm and figure out what these things should be.
And that brainstorming came up with a good approach,
Mhm.
and then BNA Now Fund started when it was set up and continues to fund the continuing education program,
Mhm.
but provides just the funds and lets the association determine what programs will take place and how much the grant money will be to them.
Now, Cammie, when we were sort of talking before the interview and deciding what we would talk about, you mentioned that one thing, and you may already have pretty well addressed it, was the background you brought to this position at BNA as Director of Library Relations, from your experience in the state and the private sector and the library world, and how important that was to you in terms of preparation. Is there anything further you want to add to that, or elaborate a bit on that?
Well, I think that's what made, for me, this job work so well, because I had been in 2 chapters around the country, and I had been worked in several different libraries, so I had a sense of what state work was about, and certainly law firm work, and had enough university law school libraries in Washington that I was acquainted with, and it gave me the background to be able to look at the full picture of library association work and special libraries as well, plus the regionals, because we supported work done with the regional chapters as well.
Well, you've actually, this sort of leads me into mentioning that you've actually got a fairly long track record of involvement professionally in association things. A lot of it was in your earlier days before I think you moved into the more high-level position at the corporation. But you were, among other things, co-chair of CONL, for our newer law librarians, for a couple of years. You chaired the Government Documents SIS, Special Interest Section. You were a couple of years as co-editor of the AALL Directory, which is a fairly substantial undertaking in its own right. And more particularly, and this is where you and I also crossed, you were on the executive board of AALL for a normal term, 3 years, 2 of which overlapped with my term on the executive board. And those were interesting and wonderful experiences. And, I think that's the kind of thing that we certainly like to encourage in colleagues. Do you want to talk all about some of that experience at this point?
Well, Pat, each of those volunteer activities matched what I was doing in my day job at the time. CONL was and continues to be a lovely way to get into AALL, and by participating in that and then directing it for 2 years, I got to know so many colleagues that I grew up with in the profession.
Mm-hmm.
That was a good start, a good welcome. But when I got to Washington, but when I got to Washington and was having to work with government documents so much, and the government documents SIS started, it helped us have a channel for dealing with issues of getting all the documents, getting them in a timely fashion, and so the depository librarians from the universities and we from law firms came together to work out issues and problems and solutions.
Mm.
So that was a big help to me when I was working in law firms in Washington. And I think that the executive board experience was outstanding in sitting with colleagues and working through problems and seeing how to come to decisions and how decisions were made.
Mhm.
I am always encouraging people when they talk about their service to serve on a board if they have the opportunity.
It is unique experience in that you're dealing with problems you didn't ever even know until you went on the board existed, or
That's right.
many of them, and as you say, having to resolve them in a collegial fashion, and hopefully in a common sense fashion as well.
Well, and sitting around that board table, you realized what made a difference in coming to a compromise,
Mhm.
what comments helped move the group along, and what were destructive.
Yeah.
And that's a good learning experience.
I think perhaps some of our politicians today could learn from that experience that we had. Hopefully they might do a little bit different job, shall we say. I'll be careful to not characterize it from too much of a political slant.
Well, certainly, from my experience in my time on the board, they would have had they listened, they would have been able to observe
Yeah.
a very good process.
Well, sort of on that, with that thought, we're sort of nearing the conclusion of this interview. I always like to give the person being interviewed the last word, although sometimes I cheat and enter in something there along the way too. But is there anything at this point, Cammie, that you would like to talk about that we haven't discussed before we conclude the interview?
Not that I can think of right away, but I do want to say that I hope through our discussion my enthusiasm for law librarianship has shown up. It is a wonderful career for challenging in many ways and a growth experience.
Well, I guess I'll cheat and say I agree fully. I say something like the last word myself. Yeah.
And thank you for taking care of this program. I am so pleased to be a part of the
Well,
oral
I was
history.
so pleased that you agreed to be part of it. I'm having a wonderful time doing these interviews and reconnecting with colleagues because, I'm retired now and I've been sort of on the shelf at home for a few years, but it's been a wonderful opportunity to see old friends such as yourself and others, and it's just been a wonderful experience. And I want to again thank you, Cammie King Hedges, for talking to us today and sharing so much about what you did and our background and our profession.